discussion here today about how we do debate in this day and age in the United States, specifically presidential debates, since those are kind of coming up imminently. That's kind of on everyone's minds, and we're just going to talk about it. He's going to give us a little lecture, and then we're going to open the floor to just have a more open discussion about that. So here we go.
All right, thanks, Casper, and thank you guys for having me. It's a real honor
Oh,
to speak
your
to you.
your uh, your
Oh,
video froze.
oh, did it? Okay, hang on a second. There we go. How is it now?
Your video's good again.
Okay, sorry about that. You know, technology works until you need it, as you know. But I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak. I'm going to kind of give you a whirlwind argument, a whirlwind thesis about presidential debates, and then we can open it up to conversation. I'd love to have a chat with you. Kind of obsessed with presidential debates. I've written about them. I study them. I teach a course here about them from time to time, so I'm pretty interested to get into this with you. So let's take a look. I'm going to go through these slides, and there are a lot of them, but don't worry, I'm going to go pretty quickly. The thesis I want to advance tonight is the idea that most people understand the presidential debates to be structurally flawed. And there are a bunch of scholars and other people who I call the structural critics in my work of presidential debates, saying the time's not good enough, the moderator system's not good enough, the topics aren't good enough, there's not enough time to respond to things, and things like that. And I call these people the structural critics of debating. I'm not terribly interested in that argument. I'm going to pursue another argument, which is that the presidential debates are kind of the logical outcome of debates, considering the history of debate in the United States and how much trouble we've had living up to this kind of idealistic standard of logical, reasonable discourse. We've had a lot of trouble with that in American history, and I'm going to talk about that in terms of debate and maybe give some suggestions of how to think about these events and maybe some other ways we could do them in the future. But first, a little bit of history. So debate starts in the colonial era is where I want to start, and there are two tracks of debate that are still with us today. On the left, you see an image, an engraving of the English pub debates, the tradition of London debate societies, which were generally working class people debating the issues of the day. You see a man throwing a cup of coffee maybe, or liquor or beer into the face of someone whose argument he doesn't like. Very raucous, very noisy, very much how much attention can you get kind of debate practice. And these are brought over into the colonies as a part of working class British tradition. On the right is an artist's depiction of Aristotle. Now, in the American university, the colonial university and colonial college tradition, the pedagogy was that you would teach based on verbal argument in a form of teaching called syllogistic disputation. You'd have the students offer formal syllogisms to the class, and then each other student in the class would have to challenge that formal syllogism. So we have this education system that's extremely formal and logical and precise, and then a public and political debating system that's raucous, noisy, and full of alcohol. It's quite a nice contradiction to start with. As we move into the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, we have to talk about this man, John Quincy Adams, who's a incredible figure in American history. If you don't know very much about him, I highly suggest you study him. He's someone who's captured my imagination, my mind many times, especially on debate. While he was the senator from Massachusetts, he served as professor of logic at Brown University, but that wasn't enough work for him. He also served as the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric at Harvard University, which is a chair appointment, and in that position he gave a series of lectures that are quite famous. They're called the Lectures on Rhetoric. They're available in 2 volumes. You guys have them at the Cornell Library, I'm sure. And in that, he kind of outlined a nice kind of barometer, or sticking a toothpick in the debate cake for the United States. And his assessment was that debate heats the passions, which he didn't necessarily say was a bad thing. And that it's a kind of action, but it's an action before another action. So as a legislator, as a career politician, Adams his father had been president. His father had helped to write the Constitution. So he had a lot of credibility. John Adams was his father. John Quincy Adams said that, the kind of debate we have in the Congress is the necessary action before action. And he also believed in this Ciceronian Roman kind of ideal, like all the early thinkers and statesmen of our country thought, that if the words are good and the speaker's good, then we can change the audience for the good. That you can actually change the quality of people through speech. And maybe it was wishful thinking, but as he entered the presidency after he ended his time in Senate, became president of the United States, served there and then served as congressman for Massachusetts after that. He still wasn't done. He was elected to Congress after that. In that Congress, he was debating some of the most heated issues of the day. On the right is sort of the artist's depiction of what 19th century congressional debate looked like. On the left is a more accurate kind of depiction where people are fighting, shouting, they're trying to get order, and people in the gallery are there to kind of see like a WWE Vince McMahon kind of event. All of this was culminated in the most ideological issue to divide the United States, that of abolition, slavery. It's hard to think of an issue, legal or social issue that divided the United States more than that. It's hard-pressed to think of one more serious, but this is a depiction, artist depiction, of the caning of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who's a Republican, by Preston Brooks, who's a Democrat from South Carolina, after Sumner had given a 2 or 3 day long speech in the Senate on why his Democratic colleagues are idiots who support slavery. And he decided to beat him with the cane instead of challenging him to a duel. But this is not the worst thing that's happened. In Joan Freeman's recent book, she talks about how the Congress was full of people pulling guns on each other, pulling knives on each other, shouting each other down. Not a place that would be, there were duels happening all the time. This is not a place where reasoned or polite or better discourse would happen the way the journalists would have us believe about what politics should look like. Actually, we're much better now, even in our sort of divided state, than we were in the past, where there was just open violence and open gunplay and people holding knives to each other's throats on the floor of the Congress and in the Senate, as depicted here. So the debate imaginary is one that's a mix of everyone's involved and everyone can talk, but it's by Aristotelian sort of rules. And those Aristotelian rules are the formality, the high logic, those kind of things. But then in the 19th century, we have these two men who capture our imagination even more about what debate should look like. On the right is Stephen A. Douglas, a senator from Illinois, who's a Democrat. And on the left, his Senate challenger, Abraham Lincoln, Republican from Illinois. They agreed to do 5 debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where they each had 90 minutes to speak and a 30-minute rebuttal. There was no moderator. And this was for the Senate, which wasn't even elected popularly at the time. That was chosen by the state legislature with the governor. Senate wasn't popularly elected until recently. And it was weird they decided to do this. I'm not sure why they decided to do this. Maybe they liked attention. Maybe they liked the idea of debate. But it set kind of the model for this idea of exchange, and that debates were normal before a campaign started. So Lincoln Douglas, they hover in our imagination quite a bit as to what political debates should be like. But you have to keep in mind that these debates were also raucous. There were a group of Stephen Douglas fans who went to every debate with a 12-pound cannon. And every time Douglas made an argument that they thought was good, they fired this cannon off. So it was more like a college football game than a nice political debate. So that brings us up to the 20th century. I said it was going to be fast. We just covered 200 years very quickly. How does this inform our situation? Well, our imaginary focuses on these series of debates, which I think we all know. The Kennedy-Nixon debates in 1960, but these debates are very nice to watch. They're very polite. They're free of any violence. They're reasoned discourse. But these debates should be thought of as an exception to the normal way that debate and argument have been covered. Is this the first presidential debate? Well, no. This is not the first presidential debate. Lincoln and Douglas were not arguing about presidency, and after that, there's no formal debates until 1960. But we also have this debate between Thomas Dewey and Harold Stassen for the Oregon Democratic primary. This is a primary debate that was on the radio, and they had a formal topic. The topic was, should the United States Communist Party be banned? One took a pro side, one took an anti side, very much like collegiate debate today. This debate goes back and forth, and there's an audio recording of this debate, should you wish to hear it, on the Internet Archive. In 1952, Governor Adlai Stevenson took on Senator Estes Kefauver, who was from Tennessee, in Florida, and they did a televised debate. But this was very risky. It was very risky for media companies to do this because of federal law. No discussion of presidential debate would be, this comes up all the time. The Communications Act of 1934, where Section 315 said that any time given to one candidate must be shared with every other candidate, which would destroy a network considering how many people run for office and different things. So those other TV stations in 48 and 52 were playing with fire there. And this really kind of hurt the ability for there to be national debates, because NBC, ABC, and CBS did not want to have to give their airtime to every single weirdo who wanted to run for office. This is also known as the equal time doctrine of the Communications Act. This was through committee hearings that were held at the request of Adlai Stevenson, who had been whipping up the public and the press by writing a lot of opinion pieces about having national debates. Senator John Pastor from Rhode Island, who was the chair of the Communications Subcommittee, had hearings, and they decided to suspend Section 315 for the 1960 presidential election, so those debates could be had. And CBS gave the airtime, and there was no equal time that needed to be enforced. That was the last time we'd have presidential debates until 1976. Why? Because there was never any kind of legislative initiative to move forward until 1976, which was the bicentennial. Gerald Ford was down about 19 points as the incumbent, and Jimmy Carter wanted people to know who he was. So how did those debates happen? Well, the exception to the law was discussed, and they knew they couldn't really change this Communications Act. They altered it in 1975 with a clause to say TV stations should give presidential candidates or national candidates airtime at the lowest bid. So the lowest price they charged an advertiser for something, that was the price they would charge a national candidate for airtime, for advertising time or political time. It's an interesting legal history to look at the kind of the cases of candidates bringing a suit against different candidates for equal time, and a lot of stuff about when is a candidate appearing on TV as a candidate and when are they appearing as the mayor or a senator or a office holder of some kind. Adlai Stevenson lost that challenge when he was running for president against Eisenhower. When the Suez Canal opened up, they appealed for equal time to address the Suez Canal War because Eisenhower had 30 minutes on national TV, and the FCC ruled that Eisenhower was appearing as the president, not as the Republican candidate for president, which became the kind of the distinction the FCC held up until this. Now, the exemption that they found in the law was that if something was a bona fide news event, it could be covered. So what did they do? Well, they said, well, let's find someone to host presidential debates, Ford and Carter. They found someone, the League of Women Voters, and they hosted the debates for most of their history. Ford and Carter had 3 debates, one of which the microphone went out and they stood there like zombies for 28 minutes. Very awkward moment in TV history. And this was the start of the very first memorandum of understanding, like what colors will be on the set, how high will the podiums be, what will the lighting be like, and will there be any cutaway shots allowed? Memorandums of understanding can be found in presidential debate archives. They're several hundred pages long. They even govern the temperature of the room. And some of the more contentious things, who will moderate, or in the era of the League of Women Voters, who will be the journalists asking the questions. So the League of Women Voters did pretty well in the bicentennial debates. But after that, they started to drop the ball. And here's the first concern. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was the Republican nominee, but John Anderson, a Republican congressman from Ohio, decided to run for president as well. This is a picture from what's called the empty podium debate, where Carter, Anderson, and Reagan were all invited by the League of Women Voters, and Carter chose not to show up. So they left that space in the middle where Carter would have been open, and it really, really, really hurt him politically, people think. So they were like, how can we convince the League of Women Voters to do just a 2-candidate debate? The other 1980 debates barely happened at all. There was so much fighting about who would ask the questions, who would speak first, how much time would there be. The League of Women Voters didn't have the force or the ability to push the candidates around. And in 1984, these debates almost didn't happen at all because they went through a list of 501 journalists before they could, both the Mondale campaign and the Reagan campaign, agree on what journalists should be the panel and ask the questions. So this caused a big problem. People from both parties decided to investigate, and they hired a person who knew a lot about debates, Newton Menow, who had been the FCC chairman in the 60s in the Kennedy administration, who was famous for giving a speech where he called television a vast wasteland, which was commemorated by the Who, and others made fun of him. The SS Minnow in Gilligan's Island was named for him because he was thought of as somebody who didn't really understand TV. But he understood debates. He had worked for Adlai Stevenson and the Carter campaign during those debates, and he had helped Adlai Stevenson with his public campaign to get national debates. So who better to chair an investigative commission and do research and figure out what should be done to preserve national presidential debates? And he's the person most directly responsible for what debates look like today. His recommendation was we should found a commission on presidential debates, who is a bipartisan organization that structures nonpartisan debates. So, wrap your head around that one. I'm not sure if that's a very clear sentence, but Newton Menow is a big believer that parties are essential to the American way of doing governance. He says maybe 3 parties would be better than 2, but he says you're never going to get debates if you don't have the 2 parties. This was founded in 1986 and said they would have control over everything, including sites, who the moderator would be, and they would take consultation from the campaigns. It has a board. Menow served as a chairman and vice chairman over the years, and the board are people who were politically active but are now out of office and out of any direct political connection to the major parties. Notable committee members recently had been Vernon Jordan, who was Bill Clinton's attorney, and Tom Daschle, the former Democratic senator from, I believe, North Dakota. I might be wrong on that, but it's these kind of figures serve on the commission, and they want to create nonpartisan debates for the 2 parties, which has been a subject of a lot of critique, as you can imagine. So 1988 rolls around, and everybody wonders if these debates are going to happen. George H.W. Bush, pictured here, former ambassador to China, former CIA director, former vice president, and in this race about to become president in 1988. He had debated on TV more than anyone else and had publicly said the debates are useless and worthless, and he didn't want to do them, and if he ever had the chance, he wouldn't do them. So this was the real test, is whether or not he would agree to debate, and he did. But he was ahead in the polls. He hated debates, and he was the closest thing to an incumbent in this race. And the CPD pushed the party, and he agreed to debate. So it's thought generally that this was the testing point for the Commission on Presidential Debates, and that's the only reason why debates seem an automatic thing, even if you have candidates who are a little squirrely or weird, or they don't want to debate. So, LBJ famously was like, why should I debate? I'm the president. That guy should be showing why he should have my job. And Richard Nixon didn't debate because he said that he might get angry and accidentally spill national security secrets. So all of these concerns are now gone. So where does that leave us? Well, there's some contemporary thoughts about why debates are good. Just summarizing this really quick. They explore an issue in depth and generate new information gaps. What do we not know? So we'll have a debate and be like, wow, we really don't know about this question that came up in the debate, by virtue of trying to win it. Debate focuses on a particular issue and allows for the discussion of broader issues. So you might debate something like healthcare and it turns into a larger issue for the audience. Well, how are we going to pay for it? What about the economy? Or we might discuss campaign reform and say, well, what about the parties seem to control everything? What about the parties? What can we do about them? These kind of things. Debates are judged on standards for debate excellence, not on who's right, which allows the audience another perspective they might not be able to get themselves. So a judge can offer this perspective of who did the better debating. And that's what makes debates good. And they also allow for corrections and adjustments. When you're face-to-face, you can interrupt. You can say, that's not what I said. Or you can lean in the microphone and go wrong every few minutes, like some notable debaters have done. This is also referred to direct clash. No, I didn't say that. Here's what I said. And they say, well, but you said, I have the article here. You said in the New York Times. And that's like a valuable thing because it speeds up the corrective of what was actually said or what the actual motives of the candidates are. So the presidential debates feature none of these elements. The structural critics have gone to town with multiple books you can read. I pulled this image off the internet. There's a lot of them making fun of the Commission on Presidential Debates, saying the presidential debates do not provide good debate standards. They are weak. They are just kind of a showcase. But the biggest concern is with third parties. The commission ran into big trouble in the 1992 race. Bill Clinton, Bush was the incumbent, and Ross Perot had been polling really well. He was very popular. He'd been polling about 20%. So the commission decided to include him in the debates in 1992. They didn't include any other parties since him, and they just said, well, it's that polling number. In 1996, he was allowed to debate. He had run again, but his numbers weren't that good, so he withdrew from the race, and then he re-entered at the last minute in hopes to get a big popularity surge, and he was not permitted because his popularity wasn't where it was before he withdrew. So this is thought of by as many as a double standard. Newton Menow continues to argue about this and continue to point out that an electoral college, a reasonable electoral college victory possibility is what's needed to participate in the debates, or a fundraising standard similar to the federal statute. Let's just borrow the federal rules. There's rules about qualification for federal matching. If you meet that, you should be allowed to debate, which I believe would mean the Libertarian Party would be invited to debates if Menow got his way. How about public opinion polls prior to the first debate? Who would you like to see debate? And then go with a Quinnipiac or another poll like that. Some kind of big pollster could do it. Quinnipiac poll, I think, is the one that they think about. And then whatever's determined in that race stands until the election, and then it's reset. And the next time we might have different standards. So Newton Menow has fired back on all of this, and he says, look, this isn't a question of quality of debates. It's either having them or not. And if you don't have a system where the parties are compelled to participate, you're not going to have any debates at all. So what would you rather have, no debates or these debates? And he says, it's not about quality. We can't get there. The parties are so nervous anyway about debating. We can't get there. And he also says these debates are not about figuring out new things. They're about providing information about candidate positions. So that's his kind of thinking about that. Something to really think about is the framer of these debates think they're kind of information exchange. And the parties have to run the debates. His initial proposal was that the commission would just be kind of a shell for the parties to arrange the debates themselves. He also said that part of his initial vision was for there to be a national debate on off election years, every year, a big televised debate. And recently CNN has done some of that with sitting candidates in non-election years, but he kind of wants it to be done through his bipartisan, nonpartisan idea. And then he believes in federal funds, which we already talked about as a qualification for third party. So he's still actively involved in this debate and what these debates should look like. So what are some of the alternatives? Well, we can go back to our imaginary Lincoln Douglas and do kind of a direct confrontation model with no moderator. This has been proposed by Jameson and Birdsell in their book on presidential debates. And then Menow would say after every debate, there should be an hour-long press conference where the candidate answers questions about the debate and their performance, not the spin room that we have now. So this is one alternative. The most interesting alternative is something called the Braintrust Debate. And what this would be is that Menow says, you know, the presidential debates are nice, but they're not really a very good job interview. What if they were a better job interview? So what that would look like is you have a topic like, let's say, economics or healthcare or foreign policy. And you have 6 or 7 experts. And the candidates ask the experts questions about this topic. And at the end of the questioning period, it goes however long it goes, each candidate has to give a speech on what their policy would be based on what they heard the experts say tonight. And that would be much, much more like what the president actually does on a day-to-day basis than to stand up at a podium with no notes and answer rapid-fire questions about giant policy from a TV newsreader, which seems like a weird way to determine who would be a better president. This is an interesting idea, but there's zero conversation or even interest in this right now. It's just an idea that Newton Menow floated out there several years ago. I think it has a lot of interesting aspects to it, but I wonder how we would get this started or how we would get this going. So I'd like to end tonight on some of my own work, which is a little different than these perspectives, which is some principles I hold about presidential debates. And my work has been focused lately on these aren't going to change. We're kind of stuck with them. How do we make them good? So I take these 3 principles as true. Presidential debates are about values, not facts. They're about the ability of a candidate to speak from the center of both local and national values. So can you see yourself in their words? They are meant to create more discourse, to unsettle, not settle. So they're meant to be resources for us to talk about the candidate we prefer and why by quoting what happened in the debate. So based on that, I've created a way that people can look at the debates and maybe get some value out of them for their own discourse and their own democratic participation with their friends and family about who to vote for. It's a 4-pronged analysis. So I'll go over this very quickly, and then I'll open it up for questions. So framework. This is when the candidate speaks about what's out there, what does the world look like, what is reality to the candidate, and does that resonate with your view of reality? Principle. What do they stand for? What are their values? What are the things they hold up very high as either ways they would start to make a decision or the values they hold in their heart or what's most important to them? Do those resonate with you or not, and why? vision, what they see as their policy platform. What are the things they would do? Does that correspond with the framework, the principle, and your ideas of what we should do? So these kind of stack, they kind of build in a way. And then action. What have they done in the past to prove that they're capable of executing the vision that they have? So with these 4 prongs, I published about this in a book from C-SPAN on politics 2 years ago. This rubric, I've tested it a little bit, but I haven't tested it with real people, and I wonder if it would improve the quality of the debates by turning them over to people to generate kind of their own views with them. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. I'd like to open up for questions now. I hope I didn't consume too much time. It's a lot of history to cover, but I'm happy to discuss with you pretty much anything you'd like to talk about in the debates, even things I didn't cover, if they're on your mind.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I definitely agree with the model. I think it's a fair representation of what people look for, and I do think that values are very important. But I want to ask you, how important do you think personality is, and do you think it's becoming more and more important? Because it seems like in the last election, at least, a big part of the appeal was also the politician's personality.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think personality has always been on our minds with presidential debates. Like when you look to the 1960s debate, Kennedy was well prepared and had kind of violated an agreement he and Nixon had talked about on the phone of not to use any notes. And Kennedy came with a notepad and some notes on it. Nixon came with nothing. Nixon came straight from the hospital. He had been suffering from the flu. And during that debate, that first 1960 debate, he had 102 fever. So the studio lights were not good for him. Those hot studio lights. I don't know if you've ever been under. You've done some theater, maybe in high school or something. Terrible. But in that debate, the media said, "Well, look, Nixon looked really sick and pale, and Kennedy looked great. He had used some bronzer, some like tan in a can, and put that on before that because he's like, I think the camera might wash me out." And Kennedy had done that. And NBC and the New York Times reported, wow, Nixon looked pretty sick. They didn't know he was actually sick, but they were like, I'm sure that Kennedy's appearance would make him look better. And so that kind of read became this idea that Nixon won on the radio, Kennedy won on the TV. We don't have any evidence for that. But personality has always been kind of an issue with it. There's a famous moment where Michael Dukakis was answering a question, the very first question of the second debate. It said, if your wife was raped and murdered, would you support the death penalty for the attacker? And he said, no, I absolutely won't. I wouldn't support the death penalty. You can see my record in Massachusetts is that I'm anti-death penalty. I'm against it. He just kind of answered like a robot. And people said, well, he's not he's not a human being. How could he be president? But I think personality, one way to think about it is in terms of motives. So we'll watch a presidential debate and people will say things like, oh, they made that argument because they really want to, blah, blah, blah. Or they responded that way because they really are, da-da-da. And that kind of speaks to personality. But I think if I was advising somebody for debate, I'd say stay cool, repeat 4 or 5 different lines, and realize the stakes are pretty low. Don't get too hot about it, because all that really matters here is whether you get your clips on the news cycle for the next day or two repeated. It'll make the more times that people hear you on CNN, the more they're going to think you won. And that would be my very cynical advice if I was working for a candidate. As a professor, though, I abhor that. I think that's terrible. And I think personality should become an issue if the arguments warrant it. If someone's like, look, I don't think that you have the temperament to be the president. I don't think you do. Here's my reasons why. I think that's perfectly legitimate, but that would never come up in the current format. I think that would be in a more direct format that might happen. I hope I answered your question, but...
Absolutely. Thank you.
I had something I would like to ask you about. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And I know at the outset of your tonight, you talked about the kind of the pub debates in the 1800s is kind of like the debate forum of the working class. But one thing that's always kind of captured my imagination is kind of the classical idea of the symposium as the kind of high-minded drinking way of, but it wasn't, the working class, it was the public intellectuals, the decision makers. I was wondering if you had any more insight or anything you would like to talk about on that, the idea of the symposium. And then it seems like we call things symposia today, but we mean something entirely different than kind of what the Greeks entailed as a symposium. So I'm just wondering if you had anything you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So symposia, we know the framework for that is a dialogue written by Plato called Symposium, and that's one of the earliest markers of that. But we do have evidence that they did happen. It's just a dinner party, and they didn't have like Spotify or Netflix. So what did they do for entertainment? Well, the hosts would come up with a question, and everyone would go around and say their part. What's interesting about symposia, to your question, is what counts as a symposium and what doesn't comes up in this dialogue, because before Socrates can speak, his rumored ex-boyfriend Alcibiades busts in drunk and is like, "Oh, are you guys talking about love? Let me tell you how love is horrible, and it's that man's fault right there." So, and Alcibiades was kind of a famous figure at that time anyway. So it's kind of like a scandalous kind of dinner party. So it's like this still kind of this mixing, I guess, might be older than I think. I think when you see symposia today, they're mostly hosted by NGOs, by think tanks and things like that. And I watch a lot of that on C-SPAN. And a symposia is kind of freewheeling conversation. I wonder if that would work for presidential debate, because it doesn't have the kind of the edge that a debate is supposed to have. But it might be a valuable thing to have. I didn't mention it, but sometimes instead of debates, the League of Women Voters would have these things called candidate forums, where the candidates would sort of sit at a table and journalists would ask them questions, and they could respond. It was like a much calmer and much more of a press conference feel to what Fox News and MSNBC do today in the primary debates, where they have 10 people on stage. And raise your hand if you've ever, it's like this long-running game of I never. But I think a symposia is an interesting thing to think about. In the academic world today, a symposia is usually a question that is far from definitive work being on it. And you invite the people working on it to kind of say where they are now. And it's very indecisive. It's sort of like a kind of taking stock. But I mean, that could be valuable. I mean, we don't necessarily have to have a debate to determine who the president is. We don't necessarily have to have that. So the question would be, if you want to have one, then what's it doing for us? And why would it be a better form of discourse than a symposium? Which I think a symposium on like what makes a great president. At Texas A&M, they have the Bush School of Public Policy, and they have a presidential rhetoric center at Texas A&M. Mm-hmm. And they often will do symposia like this, where they bring in the big scholars of presidential history and rhetoric and say, what makes a really good presidential candidate? And people will answer it the best they can. But it's kind of unanswerable because the times kind of determine that in a way too. So that's a good question. I haven't thought about symposia debates before.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I was asking, if I can just do a quick follow-up,
sure,
is that one of the central, if I recall correctly, with symposia, going back to when I was like studying all this in college,
mm-hmm.
that there was this idea that you know, this kind of like structured drinking environment allowed men to be more honest and forthright.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen this kind of idea come up within the past decade with regard to which candidate do I want to have a drink with.
That's right.
And even Obama's beer summit.
Right.
The idea that there's kind of this more like informal setting where the imbibing of alcohol, the consumption of food together promotes some type of like social connection, conversation that is less like formulaic, and you're not going for a soundbite. It's like how does that change the way that people relate to each other? So that's kind of why I was asking about that.
No, it's great. I think that might be where we're going, especially with young sitting members in politics. So we look to the example of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a congresswoman from New York 14, right next door to me, actually. And she runs a Twitch stream. And on her Twitch stream, one time she openly said, I don't need speechwriters anymore. I can just do this. And it like horrified the rhetoric community, right? So, oh my gosh, I don't need speechwriters. How am I going to send my kids to college? This kind of like panic. But there's also an interesting change there too, of this more direct kind of, like she's making food in her kitchen, talking about, subcommittee hearings. And I don't know what could be more of a symposium than that. Maybe. So one of the things Newton Minow, I think I critique him for, is that he's obsessed with television. And it makes sense. He was FCC chairman in the 60s. That was the big thing. But with podcasting, why couldn't you just make a debate more casual and as long as it needs to be? And the production quality is excellent and the costs are minimal. So why would the Commission on Presidential Debates need to exist with podcasting or with Twitch? The costs are zero to stream on Twitch. The problem is, will anybody watch you? But I think people would watch that if you had the symposium where everyone had a beer and they're like, let's join the candidates in their home. Here's Donald Trump in his kitchen. Here's Joe Biden on his deck. They're both having a beer and they're gonna question each other about the issues. That would be great, and I think it would be close to Minow's larger goal, which is information about the campaign. So, great stuff. Good question.
Yeah, I mean, kind of my own question going off that would be, since you bring up podcasting, and I guess it just makes and the symposia specifically. Are you familiar with the show Hot Ones?
No, I don't know that show.
It's on YouTube. Pretty much, it's like interviews, but the person being interviewed, it's like an interview in rounds, and each round, both the interviewer and the interviewee eat a spicy chicken wing. And the wings get progressively hotter each round. So like, the first round is just like, maybe something like, Tabasco. And then by the end, by like the 10th wing, you're having whoever's on the show take a bite of like, a wing that's doused with the hottest hot sauce in the world. Like, made with like,
like ghost pepper stuff, huh?
Just like experimental,
Oh
peppers,
God.
right?
Yeah. Military hot sauce.
Yeah, so I mean, so with that sort of thing, I just kind of wonder, like, what would your perspective be on that, as far as like, a serious debate, like, on this show it's mostly just like, random celebrities they have on, but like, what would your perspective be on that with like a serious kind of like, debate about policy be? And then I guess like otherwise, since you're a podcaster, what do you think about the prospect of a Joe Rogan moderated presidential debate?
Oh man, can you imagine? I would love to see that myself, just because I'm a scholar of discourse and stuff. But here's the big question. I think any of these things are possible, but what the question is, how do you get the parties to buy in? So when Jim Lehrer was alive, Jim Lehrer is the person who's moderated more presidential debates than anybody. Jim Lehrer, who was the host of PBS NewsHour, and he moderated all the some crazy number of debates. He did a documentary on this where he asked George W. Bush, how do you win a presidential debate? And George W. Bush said, well, I think everybody knows you can't win them, but you sure can't lose them. And he's talking about how it's about the perception of people in the world. So I think all these things are possible, but the question is, how do you get the candidates to buy in? And I think when you have young, electable congresspeople like Ocasio-Cortez and others doing this kind of radical discourse stuff, it really kind of makes it seem more possible. All it takes is one or two people to say. So here's a great example of that. What's possible and what's not. A moderator or journalist asking questions to the candidates was the only thing that was ever done until 1992, when George Stephanopoulos and James, what was his name? Carville, who were the advisors of the Clinton campaign, pushed the commission to say we need a new format, a town hall format where people will be screened and ask questions to candidates in this town hall format where they can kind of walk around. And the commission was like, no way, we're not doing it. But then it started to kind of think, well, this is kind of a nice new kind of addition. What Stephanopoulos and Carville didn't tell the commission is that this was the only form of debate Bill Clinton had used in his campaigns in Arkansas. So he had a huge upper hand, and they didn't do the adequate research, put it in there. And George H.W. Bush had no idea how to handle this format. He kind of sat awkwardly on his stool and smiled and looked kind of weird. And Ross Perot kind of ran around like crazy Ross Perot does. And Bill Clinton looked like a very sympathetic, he's the Bill Clinton of legend that we all know is very, I feel your pain, Bill Clinton. So that's a change of format. That only happened at the highest levels of the Democratic Party and the candidates team advocating and lobbying the commission and saying, we just don't really feel comfortable doing these other debates unless we do this format too. So you have that level, but then you're also going to have, younger, more tech savvy candidates coming up who are going to be like, yeah, let's do it on Twitch. Let's just ask each other questions, or let's make a series of YouTube call out videos or whatever and do that. That would be great. But I do like the idea of food and drink. That's something worth looking at, because like the previous questioner said, the history of debate is in pubs and in eating and drinking. And that's the history of it in this country, especially in the UK. The Oxford Debate Union, which is still going strong, founded in a pub, still takes place in a pub. Well, it takes place in a chamber adjacent to a pub that they founded the debates in. So that's a great question. I would like to see them eat wings. That'd be cool, or whatever. We'll see what the media says about that. They'll be like, that he didn't take the hottest swings. Does he have the appropriate personality to stand up to Putin or to stand up to whoever our enemy is at that time?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like an interesting thing on Hot Ones is you'll see in the comments they'll like criticize the way that people eat the wings. Like, if you have somebody
Right.
that just, like, takes one bite of the wing because they don't want to, like, clear the entire bone, or like some people are just like some people are really methodological about like how they eat a chicken wing. Like they really like
That's
clear
so
the bone,
funny.
they disassemble the wing, and like some people are just really like they're messy about it.
Yeah, if you remember, like this is back to Abdius's comment about personality. If you remember back when Bill de Blasio was running for mayor his first term, he was caught by the paparazzi eating a piece of pizza with a fork and a knife. And it really became the top story about whether or not he could be New York's mayor. Like who eats pizza with a fork and a knife? No,
Psychopaths.
Yeah, well, yeah, there you go. Good
No,
answer.
kidding.
Yeah, very good. That's what people thought. They're like, he can't represent us. And then his defense was, well, my wife just gave me this tie, and I didn't want to drip pizza sauce on it because it's a nice tie. So I had to resort to this to protect my marriage. And so I'm like, wow, that's a pretty good strategic defense there, Bill. Nice job.
It also reminds me of the 2016 Republican primaries where you had John Kasich on the campaign trail. Like that became like a meme. Like he was just like eating his way through the campaign trail. Just it's people really latch on to like specific things, like the way that John Kasich eats a sandwich.
Right?
Like,
Yeah.
Somehow like people were just like people were kind of weird about that. Honestly, like he didn't like he didn't eat sandwiches like a weirdo. He just ate them like a normal person. But people,
we're predisposed to see something in how they do things as making them different than us and the same as us, that's the contradiction of the presidency. We want someone we can have a beer with, but it's also someone who has to be above anything that we can do, so they can manage the executive affairs of the country. But we want it to be a down-home person and an exceptional person at the same time. And that's fascinating to me that we can hold that contradiction in our heads perfectly fine and elect people who we think are both, even though they might very clearly only be one or the other. But yeah, eating, Beto O'Rourke, he has a whole Instagram full of him eating different things in his car as he campaigned across the country for the Democratic nomination. And then what was the other one? When Hillary Clinton came to Flushing, New York, to Chinatown too, and had bubble tea. She was like, "What's bubble tea? I've never had this before." And then when she tasted it, she said, "I've never had to chew my tea before. This is great." And she got relentlessly made fun of in the press for reacting to normal food like this, So I think we kind of get a secret thrill. I think the eating and drinking is good because we get a secret thrill about how weirdly our politicians consume food. Like, oh, look how different they are from us. But at the same time, we want to hang out with them, but we also don't want to hang out with them. We want them to be in the Situation Room and not us. So
yeah, I mean, I guess like the other thing is like every time you got the Iowa caucus, you got the Iowa State Fair and the deep fried butter on a stick, and that's another thing that food is like an interesting thing in our public discourse.
Yeah, I think you could write a whole book on that, food and politics. Some people have done it in terms of like sugar and fish and lobster and things like that, but no one's done it in terms of like eating and the presidency, which would be good. But yeah, if you want to go look at some really awkward stuff, C-SPAN has on their archive video site all of the footage from like the Iowa State Fair of all the candidates. So you can go look at that when you're bored and see them doing some weird stuff, because C-SPAN just keeps the camera rolling no matter what. They don't edit it, so you can watch everything weird. And I just remember Barack Obama paying for a beer at a booth, and he's like, "Here, take the rest of these tickets and use them for everyone behind me in line until you run out." And he gave him this huge wad of tickets. I was like, okay, that's kind of cool.
I have another question for you.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem.
I would love to hear your prediction as far as the future of rhetoric is concerned with respect to kind of the prose style that future candidates take. I think, the parity between a Barack Obama and a Donald Trump in the highest office kind of sets where prose style can be with where it currently is apart. And I've heard that because we are kind of more technological, more soundbite oriented culture kind of moving that way, do you think that we're going to kind of trend away from kind of the more high-minded rhetoric, the like kind of fancy prose style, or do you think that there is something that people like about that kind of from their leaders? What do you kind of predict in terms of the way that candidates, leaders are going to move in that respect?
Yeah, I think, let me start with talking about sound bites, because I think this is an interesting way to kind of frame the larger discussion that your question opens. So sound bites are a product of television. How many of us still watch television? How many young people watch television? It's a very low number. Most young people are watching YouTube, and they're watching videos on Twitter, and they're watching Twitch. And, YouTube and Twitch and Amazon are very aware of this, and they're trying to figure out how to capture that market. So the soundbite is definitely going away as television starts to kind of turn into, if you remember when you were younger, your parents freaking out about newspapers going out of business. Television will probably start to go this way too, unless it's kind of in an on-demand, like some channels like A&E, Bravo, Sci-Fi Channel. They'll have an on-demand component you can subscribe to, or they'll be bought up by a conglomerate like Disney or Netflix or Hulu, and they'll just have access to their shows and you can just watch them on demand. But that soundbite is for the cable news and TV news. That might be going away. I don't know. Maybe when you guys have kids, it'll be going. It'll take a long time, but it makes me think about what kind of style is appropriate for the new technologies of podcasting, web video, things like that, where you can just stop and start it. It can be an hour or two long and nobody cares. It won't have any ads. People can just kind of do whatever there's so much weird stuff being produced. So what's the equivalent of the soundbite in that? And I think there's a style emerging, a podcasting style emerging. I make fun of it in my public speaking class. I'm like, what's the best way to introduce a speech? And they say, well, you should ask a question or give a quote from a figure that everyone respects or give a clear thesis. And I'm like, but what's the best way to introduce a speech on YouTube? And they kind of are quiet. And I'm like, hey, everybody, it's Steve here with a new video. If you're new around here, like, comment, subscribe, click that bell to make sure you get all the notifications for when we have a new video. Today, we're looking at presidential debates. Let's get into it right now. And then there's a trailer, right? There's a little intro video. So is that high-minded discourse or not? Well, obviously not, but we have to kind of think about what is high-minded discourse. And we have to look to the ancients first and then maybe some more modern thinkers for that. So the canon of style comes from the Roman word decorum, which we get the word decorous. We actually use the word decorum. We just use it straight out of Latin. The Greek cognate for that word is te propon, or to propon in Attic Greek. Now we get the word appropriate from that. That's a Greek cognate word. So style is always about the appropriate. Now Cicero is the source I want to speak about this because he's often misread in this. He says there are three kinds of style. There's high, medium, and low. And the kind of a simple read of him in Brutus or Orator would say, oh, okay, so high style is best and low style is worse. He's like, no. Low style is appropriate for some situations, medium for others, high for others. So in the Senate, high style is essential. But when you're talking to your troops, like my friend Julius Caesar does, you got to use the low style. Like lots of really raunchy sexual jokes will motivate the audience, but you can't do that in the forum. In the Circus Maximus, you have to be very careful because you have all kinds of people listening to you there. So you have to kind of sound like a Roman senator, but you have to be down to earth and approachable. And that's the exact same problem candidates have today. How can I make the patricians like me and the plebeians like me? How can I make the stonecutters like me and the wealthy endowed sort of wealthy families of Rome like me who have a history going back 10 generations or whatever? So that's kind of the start of the answer. The other answer is that piety is an interesting term that rhetoricians talk about, being pious or indecorous. And Kenneth Burke, who's a rhetorical theorist from the 20th century, had this really interesting thing to say, that there's a kind of piety that he called a gas house piety. That is, when you're in your courses as a university student, you act a certain way. But when you go to the bar with your friends, if you acted that way, people would think there's something wrong with you. You're supposed to swear. You're supposed to spit on the floor. You're supposed to drink the beer all sloppily and cheer and toast to ridiculous things. That's an appropriate style for that audience in that situation. So it's an interesting question. I do think that there are some people who really don't like Donald Trump because his style is low and classless and horrible. That's what people say. But at the same time, who's he appealing to? Is he interested in those people? It's an interesting thing to think about. And is his style bad or good? Well, I mean, I'm on the fence about that. I feel like he's really good at dividing us. And that's like a difficult rhetorical thing to do as president. Because of the president, everything's moved towards saying, oh, actually, we're all together on this and da-da-da. But I think people are like, yeah to that. But when someone comes up and says, oh, no, they're cheating, or, oh, they're absolutely wrong, don't let them get away with it, it's like weird to hear a president say that. So everyone kind of gets excited. So maybe it is appropriate for ramping things up, if that's what you want, if that's your rhetorical goal. I think there will be a reaction to this in terms of style. I don't know what it's going to look like, but you see a lot of this on podcasts, that there's a very different style to the conversation versus even really good journalism. It's very different, and it's actually a lot more appealing in my opinion than traditional journalism in a lot of ways. So, Joe Rogan, for as classless as he might be for people, is doing something pretty appropriate for his audience, or for the people who are interested in, and people are recognizing that. And you have a lot of people come on his show who really, why are they there? It's because they recognize he can reach a group of people they'd like to talk to. Or why did Hillary Clinton go on Howard Stern? Well, it's because he's got an audience. People like it, the people feel his style is appropriate, and she wanted to speak to that audience. So the question is, for style, who do you want to speak to, and how can you get them to pay attention to you? And in the 19th century, presidential discourse was very formal because most people were used to reading things. We didn't have audio technology like we do today. So most people were used to reading a speech, and that shaped what they wanted to hear. Just like how audio and TV and Netflix shapes how we read. Our reading level is very much like a spoken kind of thing. Whereas you have Alexis de Tocqueville commenting in Democracy on America about how weird it is to listen to the colonials debate because it sounds like they're reading an essay, but they don't have any notes. They sound like they're reading, but that shapes your mind, what kind of discourse you're exposed to. So that was kind of a rambly answer, but I guess I would say that there'll be a reaction to it. But clever people, clever political workers and thinkers are always looking at style as a question of appropriateness. And who am I speaking to, and who do I want to speak to? And you'll see that in the presidential debate tomorrow. Like, who are they talking to is a good question to think about. Who are they, is Joe Biden going to try to reach out to conservatives, to Kasich Republicans? Is Donald Trump going to try to reach out to Democrats in some way? That would be interesting to see if he tried to do that and to just accuse them all of being like crooks or whatever, like things he does. You never know what Trump is going to say. And you don't know what Joe Biden's going to say either, but there's a strategy team working on this. I've been asked to be on candidate debate strategy teams. I've never done it, not for that level, but for like local races. So I've never done it, but that's the kind of thing to think about. The very first question in that room has to be, what are we trying to do here? Who are we trying to reach? Are we down? Do we need to activate our base? Who are we trying to reach here? Is the first question. That's a question of style in terms of appropriateness.
That was a very good answer. I'm trying to think about where to bring it from here for these last kind of 5 minutes we have.
I actually had a slide with my contact information on it, but it's not showing up. So let me try to
no, you can try to pull that up, or you can.
There it is.
Drop
Hey.
it in the chat.
OBS causing trouble as usual.
Yeah.
Anyway, feel free to reach out if you want to talk about these matters further. And I'm making YouTube videos and stuff for my class, so I figured I'd put them on there and share them with everybody. So
great. So I mean, we have 5 minutes left. If anybody has any kind of final burning questions to ask, then we can get into that. And if not, we can just end a little bit early.
Yeah. I can add one thing to it that I didn't talk about in the talk, which is there has been a movement that's come around from time to time to say, if you don't participate in a presidential debate, you cannot get federal campaign matching funds. This has actually come to the floor in the House a couple of times. And I wonder what the status of this kind of legislation is. I mean, right now, it seems unthinkable for a candidate to say, I'm not going to debate. Like, that would be really weird. Like, I can't imagine anybody in that crew of primary Republican or Democratic primary, presidential types doing that. I can't imagine that. But there was a time when it was very possible that a candidate would say, I'm not coming. Jimmy Carter did it. Everyone thought George H.W. Bush was going to do it. So something to think about is what kind of, there's not really a lot of legislative representation. In fact, the Federal Communications Act still has equal time. And it's only by the fact the commission sponsors the debates that they're able to be covered as a bona fide news event. That's the legal language of the act. So is this a bona fide news event, or is this, I mean, no one's challenged this to the FCC or to the courts yet. But if somebody wanted to really change the presidential debates, they would do that. They would they would take it to a judge and see what the judge thought. Say they're breaking the law. It would be interesting to see what the arguments would be, in my view.
One real quick question.
Uh-huh.
How low is the bar for Joe Biden tomorrow? Like, what is the bare minimum he has to do in the debate to just kind of maintain status quo in the polls?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things you think about when you're strategizing these things is how can we not screw up? And working with the candidate like Joe Biden, you never know what he's going to say. He's kind of very happy to kind of speak his mind about things. So the first question would be, how do we not alienate our base? How do we not turn voters off who are already voting for us? So you really would have to, I think he would have to avoid anything related to like the Hyde Amendment, things like that are controversial among Democrats. Maybe not that controversial. Maybe among leftists, more controversial. I'm in New York City, so most of my Democratic friends are much further left than Democrats in other places in the country. But the Hyde Amendment seems like a real sticking point. I don't know if the bar is that low or not. I mean, he could easily screw up. Just like Donald Trump could screw up. But sometimes people celebrate the screw up. Like they'll say, oh, look, of course Trump did bad in the debate. He's like a regular guy. So this is like actually becomes evidence for why we should support him. Or Joe Biden, he doesn't care about rules. He's speaking the truth. The truth can't be contained, this kind of thing. But when you say the bar is low, this also is like, what's the standard by which these debates are being evaluated? That's a great question to think about. And that's the one I'm working on now. Like, I'm trying to publish about this four step rubric. And my goal is to try to normalize debate decision-making because, I'll be interviewed for the newspapers or Newsday will say, do you want to be on our panel? And they send me this thing like, do they look presidential? Did they have the facts? I'm like, well, I mean, what does that even mean? Like, how is this, like, it would be the most unfair assignment. Think about if you were graded on a presentation, the way the newspaper grades the debates, you'd be super upset. You'd go to the dean. You'd be like, this isn't a standard. It's kind of up in the air. So when you say there's a low bar, I don't know. I feel like everyone's looking for the gaffe. This is like, people like to watch NASCAR, but they only show you the crashes and the highlights. Kind of reveals the secret dark side of why people like that kind of stuff. And so the highlights of debates are when people screw up. It's the same as NASCAR. So the gaffe, the rhetorical gaffe is always haunting these candidates. So if I was prepping Joe Biden, I'd say, stick to these 5 theses that you want to always repeat when you have a chance. And then I would say, memorize these 20 little quips about Trump or about things that you can always insert if you have a quick rebuttal to Trump, there's something you can insert, and that becomes a soundbite, and that saturates the audience out there and makes them think you won, just because they're showing more clips of you than they are of Donald Trump. But it's hard to debate Donald Trump because there's no, he's not going to follow any kind of normal debating policy that a professional politician would. And a lot of his supporters say, hey, that's a good thing. He's outside of the Beltway. And in a way that we've never seen before. So I'm very curious to see what's going to happen. I'm doing a podcast with a bunch of other rhetoric professors and a former Democratic strategist who worked for Jim Webb. He's going to be on the podcast too, and we're just going to break the debate down. So look for that. That'll be posted. In the Bin is my podcast, but I'll post it on my blog too. So, but that'll be a fun conversation. I don't know what's going to happen, but remember, they said the bar was incredibly low for Biden when he debated Palin. And that's a great strategy for campaigns is when you talk to the media about a debate, never hype up your boy or your girl. Never, ever. You always lower you're like, oh, well, Donald Trump is like an expert businessman. He's been in it. He's been in the Oval Office for 4 years. He has all the information. Joe Biden is really an outsider. He's been retired. He's been with his grandkids. Obviously, Donald Trump is going to do a much better job in the debate. And that's what the Biden campaign should say. You should always be lowering expectations for the debate. And then when the debate goes well for your candidate, wow, what a surprise. They really excelled. So you want to lower expectations before debate, and you'll see the Republican and Democratic strategists doing that tomorrow on the morning shows. They'll be doing exactly that. They'll say, well, Donald Trump is not a lifelong insider fat cat politician like Joe Biden. He doesn't have the connections. He doesn't have that policy experience. But what he does have is an understanding of what it's like for people out there. That kind of thing. So,
Cool. Thank you so much for your time.
yeah, of course. No problem.
Yeah, great. I mean, thank you once again, Steve, for, spending this hour with us talking
pleasure.
about debate. We got a nice little group, and I think this was actually, a great discussion.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for having me.
All right. Okay, great. Hope everyone has a good evening.
You too. Bye, guys. Enjoy the debate tomorrow.
Bye.